Hello, welcome to Old Virginia Homes. Today we'll be visiting another Washington family mansion set in the lush Shenandoah Valley of Jefferson County, West Virginia, originally part of Virginia. It is here that we will learn about the Confederate leanings of the Washington family during the Civil War. If only these walls could talk. Fortunately, there was a lot of talk about the Washingtons during the Civil War, and many documented stories about the role that the family played in the fight. An interesting op-ed piece in the New York Times, written by James Johnston and called "The Confederate Washingtons," refers to the house we're visiting today as a mansion as big as a modern hotel that was a breeding ground for rebellion. Built in 1840, this vast Georgian-style brick mansion has the scale and formal composition that make it stand out among other plantation houses in the area. This magnificent property has seen better days. The problem with some of these imposing behemoths, and I mean that in the nicest way, is that along with the grandeur come huge upkeep costs. The setting, too, hundreds of acres in this case, requires money to maintain. I see this problem again and again. There just aren't quite enough people with disposable income and the passion for preservation required to keep these historic properties polished the way they were intended to be. The nonprofit that now owns the house does what they can with what they have. They clearly love the home and recognize that maintenance is preservation. But the faded glory aspect of this home doesn't dim its romance and actually serves as a fitting stage to the stories of hopes dashed and dreams unfulfilled. Join me as we visit Claymont Court, an old West Virginia home near Charlestown. Let's go. Claymont Court was built by Bushrod Corbin Washington, who was a grand-nephew of George Washington, in 1820 for $30,000, which was considered a massive sum. The house actually became known as Bushrod's Folly. Unfortunately, that dwelling burned in 1838. The central block, the big house, was rebuilt immediately and is commonly dated to 1840. The property remained in Washington family hands throughout the Antebellum period, surviving the Civil War era. The Washington family had heavy connections to Confederate service. Bushrod Corbin Washington II joined the Confederate Army and was captured. Brothers James and George Washington rode with Bushrod in the 12th Virginia Cavalry. James later joined Confederate Colonel John Mosby's Rangers. James and his cousin Herbert Lee Alexander, who also grew up at Claymont, were captured trying to blow up a railroad bridge. After this incident, a furious Sheridan ordered, "I want you to send to the home of Mrs. Alexander, where the guerrilla James Washington and Herbert Alexander were captured, and drive off all the stock except one milk cow, and burn every rail on the Claymont farm as punishment for harboring guerrillas." The Claymont farm was Claymont. Here is Lieutenant James Washington, a Confederate prisoner, with Captain George Custer. The men had been classmates at West Point before the war, and when Custer learned that his old friend had been captured, he requested Washington be his aide during his time in captivity. After being imprisoned at Fort McHenry in Baltimore, James died of typhoid fever. Alexander survived the war, but died of tuberculosis a year later. Bushrod survived and later moved to Washington State. Also worth mentioning here is the sad story of a pair of Washington in-laws. Two descendants of Martha Custis Washington, President Washington's wife, also experienced the harsh realities of war. William Orton Williams and Walter Gipp Peter, cousins and both Confederates, allegedly rode into a Union Army camp in Tennessee wearing Union uniforms. It may have been done on a dare. However, once their true identities were discovered, they were given a drumhead court-martial, which is a military court-martial held in the field to administer immediate justice, and they were subsequently hanged as spies. The house passed through a succession of owners in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, including the writer Frank R. Stockton, who most notably wrote The Lady or the Tiger. In the 20th century, industrialist R.J. Funkhauser arrived on the scene. Raymond Joseph Funkhauser was an influential industrialist and publisher who played a crucial role in the economic development of the Shenandoah Valley. He also purchased and probably saved some of the area's most iconic historic landmarks, including Claymont Court, which he chose to make his own residence. Today, Claymont Court remains a living landmark where it's easy to imagine its rooms echoing with spirited conversation, uncovering a portion of the story of America's evolving identity. It is now owned by the Claymont Society for Continuous Education, whose mission is to support diverse spiritual practice in daily life. But before we leave Claymont Court, it's worth looking into the distance where you can just make out another Washington family home, Blakeley. Blakeley and Claymont Court face each other across a lovely valley. Blakeley was built by John Augustine Washington II, Bushrod's brother. Although certainly beautiful, Blakeley is not as grand as Claymont Court. It is thought that this was because John Augustine Washington II knew that he would be inheriting Mount Vernon. In 1829, Mount Vernon did become his, and Blakeley was used as his summer home. Thank you for visiting Claymont Court with me, an old West Virginia home.